Jane Austen is one of the greatest writers of all time. She revolutionised the novel form with her narrative innovations and ingenious prose style, and with her endlessly influential, unforgettable, and psychologically complex characters that she crafted with subtle irony, sophisticated satire, humour, and great love. And her characters show Austen to have had a very deep understanding of the human condition. And it would not be an exaggeration to say that the novels of Jane Austen have changed my life. And just like with Shakespeare and Dickens, in whose company Austen most assuredly sits, Austen's novels have offered me healing, comfort, and wisdom in times of need. And one of the novels that has offered me the most healing is Jane Austen's sparkling, witty, energetic, charming, and captivating Pride and Prejudice. And today, as we are kicking off a brand new lecture series and read-through for Pride and Prejudice at the Hardcore Literature Book Club at patreon.com/hardcore literature. I would really love to talk to you about how to bring yourself powerfully to this novel. Let's talk about how to read one of the most popular works of classic literature of all time. Let's talk about the important historical and social context you need to take your appreciation to the next level. We'll talk about how Austen changed the course of literature forever, how she elevated the novel form, and we'll talk about the marriage market, courtship, the dating game, and the social hierarchy in Georgian England, and we will also appreciate what Austen does with character. And before we get into all of that, let's do a very quick explanation of the story, a little primer about what happens in the story. My assumption in this discussion is that you're going to know the story, you're going to know the characters, even if you haven't read Pride and Prejudice. It's gone into the collective awareness. Everybody knows who Mr Darcy is, who Elizabeth Bennet is. You've got a faint idea, even if you've not even seen an adaptation. But for newcomers to the work, here's a very brief sketch about the world we're living in. So the story of Pride and Prejudice begins in the Bennet household in Longbourn. The novel kicks off with the exciting news that a wealthy young gentleman, an eligible bachelor called Mr Bingley, has just rented the nearby manor, Netherfield Park. Bingley is on £5,000 a year, and adjusted for inflation, that's about £500,000 in today's money. And this is very exciting for the Bennet family, which is comprised of Mr and Mrs Bennet, the father and the mother, and 5 daughters. No sons, just daughters. This is very exciting, particularly for the matriarch of the family, Mrs Bennet, because this is an opportunity to see one of her daughters married off. Thus begins the story. We see that Jane Bennet, the eldest daughter, is the one who should marry Mr Bingley. And Bingley arrives with his 2 sisters, brother-in-law, and a close friend, who is the arrogant, rude, and prideful Mr Darcy. And Mr Darcy is very wealthy too. He's on £10,000 a year. In today's terms, Darcy money looks like roughly £1 million a year. Now, for contrast, Mr Bennet is on about £2,000 a year, but he needs to provide dowries for 5 daughters, so that's expensive. So they can just about keep up respectable appearances in the Bennet household, but their money isn't going too far. And they are quite low down on the gentry pecking order. Our focal character is Elizabeth Bennet, Lizzie. She's the second eldest daughter, and she is the central protagonist, and she absolutely cannot stand Mr Darcy. And thus begins one of the greatest courtships in all of literature. We see these 2 incredibly witty and robust characters actually grow to become very attracted to each other, and they actually grow to love each other very much. Now, Mrs Bennet, one of my favourite characters in all of literature, might seem hysterical. She might seem obsessed when it comes to marrying off her daughters. But it's not too hard to see why when we understand the Bennet family's situation. 5 daughters and no male heir. This is a significant problem because the the estate and the property is entailed off to the closest male heir, and that just so happens to be an odious and incredibly comic character called Mr. Collins. It's important to understand the concept of primogeniture when it came to inheriting property and wealth. This meant that property and wealth went to the first son. Now, the ideal situation at the time was you had a male son and you had a spare, so you had another male son as well. The entail was a legal device to ensure that property was handed down through the male line in order to keep the family intact. If the property was entailed on male heirs, but the current tenant of life of the family, that is Mr. Bennet in this case, had no sons, then it would go to the nearest male heir. In this case, that would be Mr. Collins, a distant cousin. So this is the Bennet family situation. Because indeed, if the property went to the daughters, whoever the daughter married, the property would then go to the husband, and so the family line would be broken up. You would not be able to pass down your wealth through the family. So why is Mrs. Bennet so frantic? Because we see that very early on she is working overtime. She's working furiously to make sure that her daughters are set up and in a good position to be married off to the most eligible man available. Well, this is her obsession because, quite frankly, she is facing the prospect of her and her daughters all being turfed out of their home when Mr. Bennet dies, because the estate will then go to Mr. Collins. Now, when Mr. Collins turns up, we see that his solution, which Mrs. Bennet is delighted about, is to try to marry one of the Bennet daughters. So for many modern readers, we might not understand why the stakes are so high. We might not see that they are high, but they absolutely are. And all of this concern about inheritance and property and estates tells us that we are following the concerns of the gentry. So we need to know what that means, and we need to understand the Georgian class system. Now, when we say Georgian, we are referring to the period in which there were 4 King Georges on the throne, one after the other, over the course of 100 years, from 1714 to 1830, and then we had a King William up until 1837, which then marks the beginning of the Victorian era with Queen Victoria. So it's very important to note that Jane Austen isn't Victorian. She's not a Victorian writer, though of course her influence is felt very strongly in the Victorian era. Jane Austen is a Georgian writer or a Regency writer. When we talk about the Regency period, we are referring to 1811 through to 1820. Now, here's the social pyramid of Jane Austen's day. At the very top, you have royalty, so king, queen, princes, princesses. Underneath that layer, still very high in the hierarchy, you have the nobility, the aristocracy, so dukes, marquises, earls, viscounts, barons. In Pride and Prejudice, the character of Lady Catherine de Bourgh is in this class, and boy does she ensure that everybody knows it. And that's not really the done thing. There's this concept known as condescension. Someone who is polite to those who are in the social rank below them is thought very well of. That's thought to be an admirable and respectable quality. But Lady Catherine, we see in Pride and Prejudice, condescends to those below her. In the words of Mr. Collins, Lady Catherine likes to have the distinction of rank preserved. And so she's not a character that we particularly like. Underneath the nobility and the aristocracy, we then get the gentry, and this is a very wide spectrum. And so because of the nuance and complexity of social class at this time, we are going to need to be a little bit reductive here. But the landed gentry, those on the upper level, would have big estates, at least a few hundred acres of land. And landowners in this class would often be high-ranking members of the clergy. They would often be families with a history of political influence. On the middle or lower end of the gentry, you'd often have lawyers, bankers, government officials, and members of the military. The amount of land one had, whether your wealth was inherited, and what your family looked like, all went into where people would place you on the gentry gentry pecking order. And if you think this sounds like a tiresome, stressful and confusing world to live in, then you would be right. And then of course underneath the gentry you've got the working classes as well. Now Austen herself was a gentleman's daughter. Her father was a clergyman, but she was on the lower end of the gentry. They didn't have a vast estate, not even as much as the Bennets have in Pride and Prejudice, but they lived at the rectory in Steventon, on a small working farm that produced enough food to sustain them. Though it is interesting to note that with her first published novel, Sense and Sensibility, published in 1811, we see the title page tells us something of the author. Not her name, but instead we're told that the novel is by a lady. And then with her next published novel, which is Pride and Prejudice, we're told that the novel is by the author of Sense and Sensibility. What she's saying when she says the novel's by a lady is she's a member of the gentry. She's part of the genteel landowning class, and ladies didn't write for money. They wrote for personal fulfillment, and she used this to secure her anonymity, because indeed it only came out after her death at the age of 41. It only came out who she was, that Jane Austen was the one writing these novels, when her brother Henry, who was also her literary executor, prefaced a new edition of her works with a biographical note that contained her name and the titles of her novels. Now, there was lots of social tension at this time because there was a new kind of gentleman, a newly emerging gentleman. The traditionally genteel way of making money is to inherit it and to get it from your estate, from your land and property. The best kind of wealth was considered to be the wealth that was inherited. It was passed down through the family and accumulated through land ownership. But we see a new emergence of businessmen and tradesmen who were making their own money in manufacturing. The Regency era is the time of the Industrial Revolution, and we see that more people had the opportunity to become truly wealthy through trade rather than through inheritance. And this is where Bingley's money comes from. His father made his money through manufacturing, so Bingley is in this new class of gentlemen. And indeed, you've also got army and naval officers, you've got clergymen who could also have a go at making their own money as well. So we start to see the concept of the self-made man emerge across the course of the 19th century, but that caused a lot of social tension because the old money, the established money and status and rank didn't like the new money. They didn't like these newcomers coming in, and they didn't see them as being the same as them. This awareness of hierarchy and rank is absolutely everywhere in Austen's novels. We see Mr Collins, for example, is a clergyman, and in this character, who's a fantastic character and a huge cast of characters, he's one of the best. Mr Collins is Austen satirising the patronage system that resulted in undeserving men from the clergy obtaining church ministries. The funny thing about Mr Collins is he's a man who has landed on his feet, and he's very much aware of it. He is the son of a merchant, and thanks to obtaining a wealthy aristocratic patron, he has found his position elevated. And so he is snivelling and grovelling and constantly harping on about how wonderful his aristocratic patroness, Lady Catherine de Bourgh, is. And she's not wonderful. She is a woman who looks down on everybody and really wants to preserve class distinctions. The humour from the novels is the fact that everybody is aware of these distinctions and how you're supposed to behave. And at the time there's very much this idea of keeping in your own place or knowing your place. Elizabeth and Darcy, for instance, that wouldn't normally be a couple that you see. That wouldn't really be a viable marriage. Mr Darcy is of course nephew to Lady Catherine de Bourgh, and we see that he's essentially trying to make his family happy. And this goes a long way to explaining why he's so arrogant, why he's so rude at the beginning of the novel. It's almost like he's trying to clamp down on how he really feels. He's telling himself, I've got to marry within my class or within the layer of my class, because indeed he, though he has aristocracy in his family, he's part of the gentry, but he's much higher in the gentry than Elizabeth, than the Bennets are. And so it's quite a thing when we see a character character like Elizabeth essentially stand up to Lady Catherine. We essentially have the individual defying the social hierarchies. Now, all of this, of course, is incredibly important when it comes to the marriage game or the marriage market, and has a very strong bearing on how you might attract a mate, a partner. Most people were marrying for money rather than love. Austen's heroines, however, marry for love, and we see the power of love when it comes to overcoming social distinctions. But when you understand how important money and social rank were when it came to marriage, you start to see the dramatic conflict built into the whole system. It's important to consider as well that for women, unless you inherited money, for women of the gentry, marriage was practically the only prospect for improving one's financial situation or for determining one's destiny. The men would do the proposing, so that's where they had the power. They had the power to propose, whereas the women had the power to accept or deny. And all of the humour arises from this social reality. Mothers scrabbling to ensure that their daughters are set up for life. It's funny, but it's truthful, and it's also understandable. In this time, reputation was absolutely everything for men and women. We see one of the reasons why Elizabeth Bennet is such a fantastic heroine and such a great protagonist is the fact that her behaviour really flies in the face of what's socially accepted. She's courageous, she's not afraid to be defiant when it comes to social norms, and so we also know something of her father, Mr Bennet, when we consider the fact that she is his favourite daughter. He likes that. For example, very early on in the book, her elder sister Jane has gone to Netherfield Park. She's accepted a dinner request at her mother's behest. She's gone to put herself in the position to have more exposure when it comes to Mr Bingley. Her mother has denied Jane the use of the carriage, and the weather is quite poor, and so Jane has ended up ill and she has to stay there, which absolutely delights Mrs Bennet no end, because, well, she can stay there and the longer the better. She can get more of that FaceTime, she can be around, she can be a presence. And Elizabeth goes to check on her. Very early on we see that she trudges through 3 miles of mud. She doesn't go by horse, she doesn't go by carriage, she goes and walks through 3 miles of mud, and she gets her clothing caked in it. And this is scandalous. This isn't the done thing, this isn't feminine or elegant. The great thing about Elizabeth is she is a free spirit, she doesn't care. Which of course is going to make her mother's job a bit more difficult for her. Marriage was so important at this time, and it's important to consider that a woman's personal, legal and financial rights were essentially non-existent. They were tied to her father, and then they went to her husband when she was married. There were no career prospects at this time for women of gentility, other than becoming, say, a governess, but that didn't have the best reputation. Now, of course, women of the working classes, on the other hand, have a very long history of working, but marrying was so important. It was your entire life. It was the biggest decision you could make. And so much thought went into who you were going to marry. There was so much thought about how to find a good man, what made a good man, how could you get the man to propose to you, how could you get him in a position where he's going to make the first move, which is funny because then you could think, well, who's really making the first move? It's all psychological, it's all very subtle, there's a lot of moving parts to the game of courtship at this time. And although the decision to accept or refuse was with the woman being proposed to, of course we see that a woman's family would have a very strong influence upon her choice too, and a man's family as well. Marriage was a family affair. The whole family were involved. And the concept of marrying for love, given all of these circumstances, was newly emerging, but it was tied in with the emergence of the novel. Thanks in part to novels like those written by Jane Austen, we start to see more and more women are giving serious consideration to the fact that they don't just want to marry for status and wealth. They want to marry someone that they're actually attracted to. They want to marry someone that they either love or could love. And so in the novel, and please beware that for a moment we're going to cover some plot details that would constitute spoilers, so if you don't want to hear that, then make sure you skip this video forward by 3 minutes now to the 22-minute mark. But in the novel, we see that when Mr Darcy makes his proposal and Elizabeth refuses him, this means so much more to us when we consider the fact that Mr Darcy's in the 0.1%. He's very high ranking. That would elevate Elizabeth's social position, and it would ensure that she and her family have a very good life. And let's be honest, even though she doesn't admit it early on, she does fancy him too, even when, and especially when, she protests how awful he is. Her refusal means so much more, because this was at a time when many women might have felt like they couldn't really afford to have integrity. They couldn't afford to be too choosy. You didn't have too many options, and if you shot one man down, well, who's to say another one would come along? Maybe not. And she turns him down because, as far as she's concerned, Darcy has advised Bingley against marrying Jane, causing her sister much unhappiness, and the caddish character of Mr Wickham has spread misinformation about him, and he's also not done himself any favours by being insulting to her family. And so, she has enough integrity to say no. Now, it doesn't matter that her impressions about him are incorrect, and we find that out over the course of the novel. When she believes that the man making the proposal, regardless of how attractive a prospect he is, when she believes that he's not a great person, her integrity tells her no, it's better to refuse and to say no to marriage than sign up to that and compromise my morality. That's quite a thing to do. It's also worth considering what would happen to a woman if she did not get married. What would happen to an unmarried woman in a time where women of the gentry couldn't work, they didn't really have career prospects? Well, it meant that unmarried women would become spinsters. And if they had brothers, they would typically end up living with their brothers and looking after their affairs. And many critics have read the part of the novel that deals with Charlotte Lucas in a very tragic way, because we see with Charlotte Lucas, she accepts the odious Mr Collins. Mr Collins proposes to Elizabeth, she turns him down, but Charlotte Lucas accepts, even though he is absolutely awful. What is the tragedy here? Well, the tragedy is the fact that she can't marry the one she loves, or doesn't feel like she can. She doesn't feel like she has many options open to her, so she has to go for this one. It's a very sad state of affairs, we might think, where your life is essentially holding out hopes for someone who might be tolerable, or holding out hopes that someone will propose to you who's not that bad. Maybe he's not amiable, maybe he's not attractive, but maybe he's not that bad. You're holding out hopes for that. You're holding out hopes that someone will propose to you and the individual will be a good investment in themselves. Both parties thought of marriage in terms of investment. And for many women, and indeed many men too, who felt confined by the social hierarchy, there were many who lived quite sad lives with partners that they didn't love. Because again, to marry the one you love was quite a thing. Now, part of attracting a man with wealth as a woman meant accruing accomplishments. Women in the upper classes weren't expected to work, but they weren't expected to be idle either. They were supposed to be able to sing and paint and speak different languages. They were expected to be able to play the piano, and they were expected to have intimate and extensive knowledge of etiquette. To understand what the accomplished woman looked like, let's hear it from Miss Bingley. This is in chapter 8 of Pride and Prejudice. A woman, she says, must have a thorough knowledge of music, singing, drawing, dancing, and the modern languages to deserve the word. And besides all this, she must possess a certain something in her air and manner of walking, the tone of her voice, her address and expressions, or the word accomplished will be but half deserved. And Mr Darcy adds something to this. He says all this she must possess, and to all this she must yet add something more substantial, in the improvement of her mind by extensive reading. Darcy has also said that the word accomplished is thrown about a lot, far too much. It has been applied to many women who do not deserve it, and he says, I cannot boast of knowing more than half a dozen in the whole range of my acquaintance that are really accomplished. Elizabeth says, I'm not surprised at your knowing only 6 accomplished women. I rather wonder now at your knowing any. To which Darcy responds, are you so severe upon your sex as to doubt the possibility of all this? Now, in order to meet someone in Austen's day, you had to attend dances, you had to attend balls. It was in the ballroom, it was in the dance hall where you would potentially meet the one you were going to marry. This was where you were going to meet your life partner. And it was so important to be able to dance. Gentlemen and ladies would take extensive lessons because the dances were complex and highly choreographed. It's important to consider as well that dances lasted a long time. Individual dances would last around 30 minutes. And there was so much etiquette around dancing. One of the rules is you didn't dance with the same partner more than twice. 2 was the max. If you danced too much with the same person, then everybody would think that you were fast on your way to getting engaged. The dance was so important though, because for 30 minutes, if you were paired up with the man that you wanted to marry, you could fleetingly touch his hand and you could talk in a rather in-depth and intimate way, and for quite a sustained period. 30 minutes at a time, if you had 2 dances, you were speaking and flirting with a prospective partner for quite a while. You had a lot of privacy in the crowd because of course you were surrounded by everybody else. You were in the midst of the dance. But you could talk one-on-one in an acceptable way. It's important to consider the fact that you were rarely alone with members of the opposite sex unless you were married or unless they were family. With a prospective partner, you weren't going on walks with each other one-on-one, you weren't going horseback riding together, you weren't spending much time together, so the dance was a perfect opportunity to really find out what that other person was all about. You could have a proper talk with them. The only time you were alone with a member of the opposite sex when you were unmarried is when you were being proposed to. And we see a lot of comedy in the novel arises from Mrs Bennet, for example, hurrying her family, hurrying her daughters out of the room so that a proposal can take place. If you were one-on-one, man and woman in a room, then there's a proposal coming. So that's a good thing about the dance. You could really get to know a potential partner. But the bad thing was if you were partnered up with an odious gentleman, with somebody you really didn't want to be dancing with. 30 minutes? Oh, that's a very, very long time. Lizzie dancing with Mr Collins, for example, would have been painful. That 30 minutes would have dragged on and on. Another really important bit of etiquette when it came to dancing was the fact that gentlemen were expected to ask the women seated, the women who didn't have a partner, they were expected to ask these women to dance. Yeah, a gentleman was not supposed to let any woman feel left out. And so very early on, if you know this, then you get the humour when Mr Bingley tells his friend Mr Darcy that there are many agreeable, wonderful, beautiful looking women in the dance hall, and Darcy is prompted to dance. Why don't you dance with these women? And what does Darcy say? He essentially says that he's in no mood to give consequence to young ladies who are slighted by other men. He refuses to do the gentlemanly thing. He is really transgressing against etiquette. This is not the done thing. This is very poor and rude behaviour on Mr Darcy's part very early on. And so we can see why Elizabeth takes an instant dislike to him. Another important thing to consider about these balls, the dances, is the fact that this was the setting for a young girl's coming out. Now, the phrase coming out used to mean something different from what it means today. When a girl of the gentry turned 16, she officially became a young lady, and she would have her formal introduction to society. This was her coming out. Essentially, at this point, she was old enough to be someone's bride. And women would marry quite young. Men would be a little bit older because they were often waiting on their inheritance. So men would often marry in their 20s. A man would typically come of age at the age of 21. For women, it was 16. Up until this point, for young girls, they were expected to be seen and not heard. They weren't part of society. They had to be quiet when people were talking, and when these balls took place, when their older sisters were going to these dances and getting all excited, they had to stay at home. So it was a really big thing for a young girl to have her debut in society. And mothers would put a lot of thought in how their daughters would look, how they'd behave, because now it's time to find a match. It's now time to try and set yourself up for life. This was the work. And so we see this drama is in the story too, with the youngest Bennet daughter, Lydia. She's been brought out a little earlier than she should, and Lady Catherine de Bourgh makes comment on this. All 5 daughters out at once. Mrs Bennet essentially says, well, it would be unkind to keep her in until her sisters were married, i.e. her sisters are taking their sweet time being proposed to, so we can't wait around forever now, can we? Now, what we see when we read Pride and Prejudice is that Jane Austen had a very deep and intimate understanding about courtship, interpersonal communication, marriage, the implications of everything, the implications of your rank, and yet Austen herself was unmarried. Now, primary reason for this might have been due to the fact that she didn't have a dowry. So that would have made her not the best prospect to marry. That would have been off-putting even for gentlemen who wanted to marry her. Their families would be saying, well, she's not bringing anything. She's not bringing any wealth into the family for the future generations. To get a sense of where Pride and Prejudice came from, Jane Austen was 20 years old when she was writing this novel, which is something I marvel at. She was so young and she wrote something so mature, so enduring, so wise, so funny. So this made Austen the same age as Elizabeth Bennet. She was 20 when she wrote the first draft of Pride and Prejudice, but by the time it was published in 1813, Austen was 37 years old. So there was 17 years between the writing and the publishing of it. Sense and Sensibility and Northanger Abbey had similar waiting times when it came to them finally being published too. Northanger Abbey was actually published posthumously after Austen had died. And so at the time of publishing Pride and Prejudice, Austen would only live for another 4 years. She would sadly die at the very young age of just 41. Seeing as she wrote 2 of her masterpieces around this time, very close to her passing away, Emma and Persuasion, and seeing as she was very busy furiously revising and bringing her older works to publication, it is an absolute tragedy to consider the novels we do not have. Had Jane Austen lived to the same age as Shakespeare, had she made it to her 50s, we can safely assume that we would have at least had 3, if not more, masterpieces on our hands. We would have had many more great novels. What a tragedy that we don't. And we can make a pretty good guess that these novels would be very different from the ones we have, because we can see that with each and every one of her works, they're very different from one another. Yes, they're courtship novels. They all fall into the category of Regency romance, which she pioneered, but they're all so different in tone and in aim, in what they are exploring. And as John Mullen says, each of her heroines was a reaction to the one that came before. That's why they are all so distinct and unique. And so we can take it that we lost out on having a strong handful of more unique novels. Now, all of this to say, I think Pride and Prejudice very much bears the marks of a young Jane, or a younger Jane. Although she most certainly would have tightened things up with this novel, she would have improved a lot of the dialogue, and she removed a fair bit, because indeed Pride and Prejudice was originally longer than it is today. I think that the wit and the sparkling energy, the humour and the characters, I think they were pretty much all there from the beginning. I think she got it right pretty early on. Around the time of writing, it actually looked like Jane might have found her one, her Irish love, a man called Tom Lefroy, and he would actually go on to be Lord Chief Justice of Ireland. Although he seemed like he could have been the one, he ended up being the one who got away. We can see in one of her letters to her sister Cassandra, and we know a lot about Jane Austen thanks to these letters, although indeed Cassandra actually ended up burning a lot of Jane's letters, potentially because Jane had written some things that might not have been too kind when it came to certain members of her family. Jane Austen has a reputation of being a very saintly woman, a very morally good and forgiving woman, but I think we can tell from her letters and definitely from her novels that she did have a caustic, biting wit, and she certainly could say a thing or two about those she disliked. But in one of her letters, she speaks of dancing with her Irish friend. And she says, after a dance, that we behaved in a most profligate and shocking way by dancing and sitting down together. Ultimately, Austen herself never married, but she was proposed to by a family friend who was 6 years her junior. She was 27 when she was proposed to and he was 21. She actually accepted but then changed her mind and turned him down the very next day. We think ultimately, and we have evidence for this in the heroines that she wrote, we think ultimately that she just didn't love him. As we've said, Austen's heroines marry for love, but they are also shrewd enough to marry a man with great prospects too. Austen may have been unmarried and she may not have had any children, but to her, her novels were her children. She referred to her stories as her children. And of course many wonder, would we have the novels if she had been married? Thanks to her life circumstances, Austen ultimately gave birth to the novel itself, the novel as a respectable and new form of writing. She absolutely changed the landscape of imaginative literature. To understand Austen's contribution to the rise of the novel, we need to understand what the novel used to be. What did people used to consider the novel to be? Well, firstly, novels weren't called novel. The word itself means new. It's novel or a novelty. We would talk about Gothic stories, or we would talk about romances, that which we call novels today in Austen's time, or when Austen was growing up, wouldn't really be referred to as novels, or the ones that were referred to in a very disparaging way. In a time when books of sermons would sell out on the first day of publication, that which we call novels today was seen as scandalous and immoral entertainment. And many of the books that we study, that academics write dissertations on today, was seen as quite lowbrow. It was not seen as the done thing to be caught reading. But it's writers like Austen who were responsible for a massive cultural shift in perspective when it came to the novel as a form of writing, taking the lowbrow, the escapist, the immersive, taking popular fiction and making it literary. We can see Austen's defence of the novel in an early chapter of Northanger Abbey. This is a really iconic passage. "I am no novel reader. I seldom look into novels. Do not imagine that I often read novels. Such is the common cant. And what are you reading, miss?" "Oh, it is only a novel," replies the young lady, while she lays down her book with affected indifference or momentary shame. "It is only Cecilia, or Camilla, or Belinda, or in short, only some work in which the greatest powers of the mind are displayed, in which the most thorough knowledge of human nature, the happiest delineation of its varieties, the liveliest infusions of wit and humour are conveyed to the world in the best chosen language." Oh yes, it's just that. This is Austen defending the charges against the novel. Oh, it's just a novel, it's disposable, it's scandalous, it's not really respectable, and she's saying no, these are beautifully crafted works of art where the author has put a lot of labour, a lot of love, a lot of care into its presentation, into the exploration of the human condition. What do you mean it's only a novel? In a letter to her sister Cassandra, and I would implore Austenites or Janeites to get hold of an edition of Austen's letters if you haven't already, in a letter to her sister, Austen says, "Our family are great novel readers and not ashamed of being so," which seems a bit strange to us today, where again we study novels. Reading novels is seen to be a very elevated thing to do, a really worthy way of spending your time, a really great intellectual pursuit. Why would you be ashamed of reading novels? Because at the time it was considered shameful. Indeed, imagination itself was considered dangerous, it was considered sinful. There were many that thought indulging one's imagination was the sort of thing that would lead to revolution, bloody revolution. So people were very sceptical about novels or any flights of fancy or anything that purported to tell you a story that wasn't true. So we see that a lot of novelists, we see this with Defoe, would pretend that they found the story and it's a true story. Yeah, even Cervantes does this with Don Quixote, even way back in the early 17th 17th century. Oh, I just found the story. This is someone else's story, or they purport it to be true even though they have manufactured it. We see that the novel rises with the Industrial Revolution as more people had a little bit more leisure time in which to read, what with, among other things, more standardised working hours. And we see in the 19th century that the subscription library really takes off. It becomes really popular. Libraries like Moody's Lending Library, where you'd borrow the first volume of a novel, you'd read it, and then you'd return it and you'd get volume 2. Typically novels were published in 3 volumes. Those subscriptions were often quite hefty, so you had to be firmly in the middle class or the upper middle class in order to afford that. And the prospect of having your own personal library, now that was quite a thing, because books were very expensive. To actually own books would have been quite impressive and would have been prohibitive for a lot of people. Fiction was becoming increasingly more accessible in newspapers, in serialised form, and so the general public would read from week to week or month to month the latest instalments of their favourite stories. And we see that even the working classes began to read. There's a wonderful moment in Ian Watts's The Rise of the Novel, which I highly recommend because it really helps contextualise the era just before Austen. Watts talks of servants reading by the moonlight after their shift. Perhaps they couldn't afford candles, but they got hold of a copy of the latest riveting story, and by the light of the moon they would stay up reading. The people who had the most reading time, generally speaking, were women. Gentry women, but women generally, and it increasingly became something that genteel women would devote themselves to. And we see that early novels, despite the profusion of male pen names, were often written by women, for women, with women's experiences in mind. Before Austen, we have Aphra Behn, we have Elizabeth Inchbald, we have Eliza Haywood, we've got Charlotte Smith, Fanny Burney, Maria Edgeworth, who's considered to be the Irish Austen. We've got writers like Amelia Opie. And then after Austen, we have the Bronte sisters, again adopting male pen names, but women writing primarily about women for women readers, though male readers would fall in love with them too. We have Elizabeth Gaskell, we have George Eliot. Reading was incredibly important to Jane Austen and the Austen family. We know that her father's library had 500 volumes and she read Shakespeare, and we can see the Shakespearean influence in Pride and Prejudice with Mr Darcy and Elizabeth Bennet. They are a manifestation or a logical extension of Beatrice and Benedict from Much Ado About Nothing. Indeed, I see a lot of Rosalind from As You Like It in Elizabeth Bennet too. Austen would read Milton, she would read Dr Samuel Johnson, of course she would read Samuel Richardson, Clarissa, Pamela, Sir Charles Grandison, but she would also read the popular writers at the time. We can tell that she inhaled the stories of Fanny Burney, who wrote Cecilia, Camilla and Evelina. Cecilia was published by subscription, and we have evidence that a Miss J. Austen from Steventon, who would have been 20 years old at the time, was down on record as subscribing to the story, essentially telling the publisher that she was interested in it continuing and she would like to read it. Though in the absence of that evidence, we could still see the influence of Fanny Burney in the title of Pride and Prejudice itself, because the title is taken from the final chapter of Burney's Cecilia, in which the phrase appears 3 times in capital letters on 1 page. Pride and Prejudice rose out of the epistolary form and writing. The novel was originally called First Impressions, and it was actually a bunch of letters back and forth, dangerous liaisons or Clarissa style. This was a very popular form of storytelling, the epistolary, because Austen was situated in the great age of letters. And when you wrote a letter to somebody, you could be more candid, you could be more truthful, sometimes you could be more guarded, and people would pour great efforts into analysing each other's letters. What's meant by this? What's between the lines? And there was a huge etiquette around letter writing. Indeed, similar to the etiquette around dancing, where you weren't supposed to dance more than twice with a partner unless you were signalling you were engaged. If a man and a woman who were not family were exchanging many letters together, then it would be assumed that they were engaged. And there were whole guides on how to write letters that would be very popular at the time. And so we see many narratives were epistolary. epistolary. They were just built out of letter writing, because you can have first-person narrative from different points of view, and it was relatable. Readers related to that because letters formed a huge part of their day-to-day lives. So the vicarious experience felt truthful. The population at the time was a population of letter writers who were becoming readers. And readers of fiction would read aloud, and it would be communal. You would gather the family around together, you'd divvy up the different roles, and you would take turns in reading the story aloud. Indeed, it was Jane Austen reading the first draft of First Impressions, what would become Pride and Prejudice. It was her reading it aloud to her family that led to its publication, because her family was enraptured by it, and her father particularly so. If you find yourself becoming enamoured with Mr Bennet, if you find that he's drawn lovingly and with a lot of affection, and you think, oh, was this inspired by Austen's own father? I think so, because he actually prompted his daughter to push it into publication. He said this has to be published. So we see that Austen comes out of the epistolary form. Her early narratives, her juvenilia, some of it is epistolary, and then she starts satirising the epistolary. She starts poking fun at it. But what's really interesting is Austen starts to meld two different styles. The style of Fielding and the style of Richardson. And what we get in Austen is realism, social realism. When you read an Austen novel, you think, I've met these characters before, yeah? They're not quite types, they're unique. In fact, I would call them rounded types. Yes, they all have their preoccupations and their concerns and their defining traits, but you buy into the individuality of all of her characters. They feel like living, breathing human beings, particularly the central protagonists. They contradict themselves, they talk to themselves and overhear themselves, and they change by virtue of hearing themselves think things through. There's this concept from Harold Bloom called self-overhearing, which he applies to Shakespeare. Shakespeare invented the human in literature because he showed characters that changed by virtue of overhearing themselves. And Austen is thoroughly Shakespearean. We can trace a line from Shakespeare through Richardson onto Austen, and then basically on to any influential writer that came after them. So we buy into the reality of these characters, but we also recognise them. When we meet the Bennet family, and you can't take the Bennets anywhere, can you? When we meet the Bennets, we think, that's our family. Well, of course it is, because it was Austen's family, and the Bennets are everybody's family. They are satirical, blown-up versions, distortions of the truth. They're very truthful, but they're very funny too. Sir Walter Scott, who was one of the most popular novelists at the time, reviewed Jane Austen's Emma, and he noted what Austen was doing, the marvellous thing that she was doing, and the revolutionary thing she was doing. Scott noted that novels, which was still a new form of writing, were either like those of Henry Fielding or Fanny Burney, and they had a lot of unrealistic elements. They had a lot of sentimentality and melodrama. Now, you might have some realism here and there, but that would be punctuated by exciting incident. And by exciting, we mean rather unbelievable. We would have a little bit of realism, but then we would have sword fights and abductions and acts of heroism. And Scott praised Jane Austen's work because she presented realistic characters and situations that were believable within the bounds of ordinary life. This was revolutionary. When it came to telling a story, when it came to narration, you didn't have a lot of options. You had two main flavours of narration, if you like. You had first-person narration, where you would hear things from one point of view. We can look to a novel that came after Austen's novel, Jane Eyre, Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre, and we can see that the novel is delivered in a first-hand way, a first-hand account. That means some information is delayed. It means that the world is subjective. The information is contingent upon how the character sees the world. What does that mean? It means that first-person narrators are unreliable, and that creates a lot of conflict and tension and drama in itself. Then you've got third-person omniscient narration. That's where the writer is like God in their own universe, and they can zoom in and then out of their protagonists' minds, and they can be in many different places. Now, this feels more truthful, more representative, and more reliable. But this is actually highly selective too, because the author chooses what to represent. And sometimes the author is obtrusive and sometimes they're not. Sometimes they try to get away with hiding behind the scenes, but in Austen's time, very often the author themselves was like a character. You would get to know the author, they'd speak to you, and they would comment about the characters and the fictionality. And that's an element that makes some of those older stories, some of those older third-person accounts, like Tom Jones, rather difficult for the modern reader because it takes us out of the story, it breaks our immersion. It didn't do so for the readers back then, but it does so for us today. And that's because we've been spoilt by realist narrative. And who do we thank for realist narrative and psychological complexity? Jane Austen, in large part, and the writers that she would influence. We see that omniscient narration really reaches its sublime peak in Tolstoy, in novels like Anna Karenina and War and Peace. And Tolstoy learnt much from Jane Austen, and he even self-consciously modelled his first novel on the English novels and then the French novels that came a little bit after. Now, the really exciting thing about the writing of Jane Austen is the fact that she pioneered a really revolutionary style of narrative, of telling stories. She was the pioneer of what is known as free indirect discourse or free indirect style. This means we see things the way a character would see things. We see things through their eyes and we see their language being used, but it is the author or the author construct speaking. So we have writing in the third person that contains the essential elements of first person narration. So we have that sense of objectivity. We also have a sense of intimacy with the characters and the writer, but we get through that third person narration, we get to have the different characters' thoughts on the situation. So we can observe the world at a distance, but also simultaneously through the eyes of the characters. An example of what free indirect discourse looks like comes in chapter 59 of Pride and Prejudice, in which we get this. Elizabeth's mind was now relieved from a very heavy weight, and after half an hour's quiet reflection in her own room, she was able to join the others with tolerable composure. Now, because we are so used to this style today, we probably don't even notice what's going on here. We probably don't even notice how revolutionary this is. Notice the word tolerable. She was able to join the others with tolerable composure. Whose word is this? Before Austen, writers would have written much the same thing, but they would have just said she was able to join the others with composure. Yeah? If it's objective or it's meant to be third person omniscient narration, you wouldn't have that tolerable. That's something from Elizabeth's point of view. So the way she sees the world intrudes into the authorial style, or indeed the author is able to see the world and help us see the world through Lizzie's eyes. Now, interestingly, the first time we hear the word tolerable, it's actually directly from Mr Darcy. She is tolerable but not handsome enough to tempt me. But after that, we get this word over and over again. We get this word often when we are seeing things from Elizabeth's point of view, which I think is very funny. And here, in free indirect discourse, that word is her own, and Austen does this over and over and over again, consistently and relentlessly. And Tom Kamer says that it has been calculated that Pride and Prejudice filters its narrative at different points through no fewer than 19 centres of consciousness, more than any other Austen novel, with Mansfield Park at 13, the nearest competitor. This is extraordinary. No longer are we seeing things from the first person point of view, from characters writing in the epistolary, I did this, I did that, I felt like this, I felt like that. No longer are we seeing things from a detached third person point of view where we're very aware of the author, but we don't fully know the characters, we don't know them too intimately, we just know what we can see from above. Now we get a miraculous and sublime blend of the two. Indeed, keep this in mind when you read Pride and Prejudice, because you can notice this on pretty much any page. In fact, you can look at the very first line of the novel and you can notice that something interesting is going on. We often ask, whose voice is this? Who's speaking? Whose terminology is this? What's the very first line of Pride and Prejudice? It's potentially the most famous line in all of literature, along with Charles Dickens's "It was the best of times, it was the worst of times." Pride and Prejudice begins with this: "It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife." Is this a truth? Is it a truth universally acknowledged? Who is speaking here? Is this Austen herself? Does she believe this? Or is she, in a very ironic and satirical way, giving voice to Meryton opinion? Is she giving voice to the opinion of these country towns? Is she giving voice to the opinion of the Mrs Bennets in the world? Indeed, in one television adaptation of Pride and Prejudice, the 1995 adaptation, which I think is absolutely splendid and I wholeheartedly recommend it, it's the one with Colin Firth playing Mr Darcy, we see that they make Elizabeth Bennet say it. She gives voice to this famous line. But for me, it always felt like this was something that Mrs Bennet would say, or indeed if Lizzie would say it, it's the sort of thing she would say with a wry, ironic grin, as though making fun of someone like her mother. We're told after this first line, "However little known the feelings or views of such a man may be on his first entering a neighbourhood, this truth is so well fixed in the minds of the surrounding families," there we have it, so we know where that comes from, "that he is considered as the rightful property of someone or other of their daughters." And then who has the first lines in the work? It is Mrs Bennet, of course. Is it a truth universally acknowledged? We see that Mr Bingley turns up and we think he's not really got his mind on marriage, not to the degree at least that Mrs Bennet does, and the women of the neighbourhood do. This is an imposition. This is wishful thinking. This truth is actually how the Mrs Bennets view the world. So is it a truth? We also get some divine Austenian irony here. Irony is saying one thing but meaning another, not saying what you mean, not meaning what you say. We get this in Shakespeare and we get this in Austen in an overwhelmingly sublime degree. And irony brings subtext with it. Because when you read a Jane Austen novel, you don't just read the words on the page, you have to read what's not being said. You have to read what is being meant or being implied or being referred to, and you can't take everything written down as straight facts, straight information. There's always many different layers and levels and nuances of meaning, like with great poetry. My reading challenge to you when you read Pride and Prejudice is to try to work out, when you see instances of what looks to be free and direct discourse, when you see words that intrude into the narrative and you think, that word is not the narrator's word, that's one of the character's words. Try to work out which character's voice is blending in. From whose position are we seeing the world? Whose eyes are we looking through? What you may notice when you read Pride and Prejudice, that it's often through the women characters, yeah? We see the world through Elizabeth's eyes. We know how Jane feels, we know how Mrs Bennet feels. We don't often get much in the way of point of view from Mr Bingley or Mr Darcy, and so when it does happen, it's very, very striking and arresting. For example, when Mr Darcy notices the beautiful expression of Elizabeth's eyes. That stands out because we know how he feels, but because Austen is really letting us know how someone like Elizabeth feels, but kind of holding back how a Mr Darcy feels, we puzzle over and analyse and interpret and think about what are they thinking, how are they feeling, and so in that way we are living vicariously. It's like we're there and we're doing the courtship dance ourselves. So what we get in the novels of Austen is her narrative ingenuity and her construction of complex characters who feel like real people blends together. They're intricately bound up with one another. The narrative and the characters are connected, and the characters are the story. At least in my opinion, because the characters are so splendid. They contain within them all of the drama, all of the conflict, all of the dilemmas, all of the humour, all of the realism. We recognise our friends and family in the characters of Jane Austen. And Austen constantly implores us to ponder over What is character? What does character mean exactly? Characters often refer to their character. My character is such that I do such and such, or this is my character. Our character means what we do, how we behave, how we act. Aristotle taught us that. And what we say. We're defined by our behaviour in the world and our voice, what we choose to say or not. And everything hinges upon that. And we have very rich inner lives, but we know ourselves in conjunction and juxtaposition with others. We know ourselves by virtue of what we say and how others respond to what we say. And great characters are those who play roles. And I think there's an extraordinary amount of theatricality in Austen's novels. In fact, her dialogue is so sparkling and so perfect that we see that the producers of television dramas and movies don't really have to do much. They just wholesale lift passages of dialogue and they can get good actors to say the words, and Austen will do the heavy lifting. But the characters are often conflicted, they do change, but they also play roles. And I wonder how much of Mrs Bennet is the role that she's playing? How much is she embracing it and pivoting into it and really going with it? Mr Bennet plays a role. Mr Darcy plays a role, and so does Elizabeth, and they learn to see through those roles and penetrate to the reality underneath the appearance. Austen did so many extraordinary things. She has her types, sure, she has her Mr Wickhams, she takes the type of a rake or a libertine and he is there in the novel, but she has her complex Byronic protagonists like in the form of Mr Darcy, but she breathes so much life into these characters that they are not types anymore. They cannot be pinned down to one thing or another. They are complex. What she does as well is she takes characters that she clearly met in her real life. We think that Mr Collins was a real man that she actually encountered, and that is why he feels so truthful. That is why there is such biting wit and scathing satire present in her depiction of him. And the most extraordinary thing is what she does with her peripheral characters. And E.M. Forster, who was significantly influenced by Austen, he loved Jane Austen, in his aspects of the novel would talk about flat versus round characters. Round characters are those who contain Whitmanian multitudes, who are psychologically complex, whereas flat characters kind of have a one-track mind and only do one thing. But I do not think it is too useful to designate characters into those two camps, because, as James Wood says, there are many people that we know in our lives who would fit the designation of flat. And there are many characters who aren't psychologically complex or particularly round in fiction who end up being the most entertaining, the most vitalistic, the most unforgettable. This is not only true for Dickens and Shakespeare, but it's true for Austen too. Indeed, one of my favourite characters in all of literature is a peripheral character, and that is, of course, the wonderful Mrs Bennet. Ultimately, we know we have great characters on our hands when we not only recognise people that we love and people that we know, but we can ask questions about these protagonists that don't sound ludicrous. Like, you can literally start to supply answers. You can probe into their inner lives and you can flesh out their backstory and you can talk about them as though they're real people. Indeed, Nabokov would talk of old Russians in discussion about Tolstoy. They would refer to the characters of Anna Karenina, for example, as though they were old friends. And I think we do that with Austen too. I've spoken before about one of the great values of literature is being able to see a reflection of ourselves, and what's projected is reflected. So when you respond to a work of literature, it's like responding to a Rorschach test. You will know your thoughts on the most enduring and powerful and profound themes of the human condition when you articulate your thoughts in response to a work of fiction. You'll know your thoughts on good and evil, men and women, love, death, war, absolutely everything that you can and should think through. You will be given an opportunity to when it comes to the great books. If you really bring yourself in a powerful way, if you really bring yourself to these fictional worlds and you live in them, you inhabit them, and you spend time with the characters. That's wonderful, seeing elements of yourself and working through your opinions. And Emerson would tell us that great literature is that which shows us our own rejected thoughts. They return to us with an alienated majesty, and we are forced to take our thoughts from another. That's what Shakespeare does. We recognise things that we've already thought and felt, and we get that in Austen too. But one of the greatest joys I get when it comes to reading through the novels of Jane Austen is spending time in the company of others. You get a sense of otherness, not just a sense of yourself. It really truly does feel like you're in the company of friends and family. And so we're going to enjoy what I believe to be one of the greatest novels of all time, and we're going to give Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice a very deep reading and appreciation together at the Hardcore Literature Book Club at patreon.com/hardcore literature. We are going to reconnect with the first reader, and we're going to approach this as they approached it originally, as a 3-volume novel. So we're going to break it into 3 stages, and we're going to have our discussions on alternating weekends. Our lectures come out at the weekend. At time of recording this weekend coming, we will have a lecture on Tartuffe by Molière, because that's our dramatic appreciation, and we're really going to find the juxtaposition of appreciating the French comic dramatic master when it comes to comedies of manners. We're going to appreciate Molière, and we're going to compare and contrast, and we're going to see how does French drama, when it comes to comedies of manners, how does that compare to the English novel, the English comedy of manners in the hands of the absolute master Jane Austen. So this is going to be a really complimentary reading season. So this coming weekend we're going to appreciate Molière, and then the weekend after that we will discuss Jane Austen, and we'll go back and forth in that fashion. So book club readers will have a fortnight to appreciate their reading allotment, their prescription, their prescribed page count. And along the way, I will be recommending secondary resources and literary rabbit holes for you to follow up. I will be supplying recommendations of things to watch, documentaries and films and adaptations. I'll be making recommendations for essays and books that you can explore to deepen your love of Jane Austen, of Pride and Prejudice. And I'll be posing reading questions and assignments to help deepen your journaling around the great books and to help facilitate some great discussion around this novel. The reading threads at the Hardcore Literature Book Club are absolutely extraordinary. It is as fun to read through the discussion threads at the book club as it is to read these actual books. They really add to the experience of great literature. It's wonderful to be in the company of like-minded lovers of literature. The best kind of reading is communal reading. It's sharing your love with another, and as is the case with so many readers around the world, we often don't have people in our actual lives, in reality, who we can talk about the great books with. This is an experience that I think every bookworm can relate to. But at the Hardcore Literature Book Club, kindred spirits have come together, and we can share that appreciation with one another. So if you want to discuss the great books and you want to get even more out of your deep reading, then you have a home at the Hardcore Literature Book Club, and you'll be very warmly welcomed. And I would absolutely love to share the journey through Pride and Prejudice with you. We also have an extensive back catalogue of bookish lectures and discussions and read-throughs that are available on demand for you to stream at any time. We have another Jane Austen lecture series, reading through Persuasion. We have lectures for Virginia Woolf, Emily Bronte, Charlotte Bronte, George Eliot, Charles Dickens, and many more. And we have a very exciting syllabus up ahead. At time of recording, we have enjoyed together works by John Steinbeck and Bulgakov, poetry by Walt Whitman, plays by William Shakespeare, content of which is always available for you to access at your own pace. And up ahead this year, we will be reading The Tale of Genji together. We'll be reading Montaigne. We'll be reading Thomas Hardy and Toni Morrison and Dante's Inferno. We'll be reading so many great books that will significantly improve your life. Throughout the Pride and Prejudice lecture series, we'll be enjoying some dramatic readings. We'll be making this story really come to life. We'll be delighting in it together, and we'll be extracting wisdom that we can take into our lives. Wisdom about integrity, truth, love, courtship, pride, and of course, prejudice. And I'm going to leave it there for today, and I wanted to say a huge thank you for watching, thank you for reading along, and please let us know your experience with this novel, with Pride and Prejudice, and with Jane Austen. What Jane Austen novel is your favourite? How would you rank them if you've read them all? What are the things that you love most about her novels, and how would you enthuse other readers to dive into great works like Pride and Prejudice? Thank you very much for watching again. I appreciate you, and I hope you have a lovely day. Happy reading, everybody, and bye-bye for now.